We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that there are folks that'll inevitably be kind of zooming and logging in the next couple of minutes, but I do have just a couple of introductory slides and want to give some background and wanted to thank everyone for attending what's become a monthly kind of webinar series in the Stanford Biodesign for Biodesign, the policy program at the Biodesign Center. We're very proud. It's the first year of the policy program and our fellowship. And with that, I'm going to give just a little background on what is biodesign. If those of you that are new to Stanford or have been at Stanford and not familiar, the Biodesign Center of Biodesign been around for 20 years, where an incredible focus has been on the intersection of clinical excellence, translation, innovation, and with the policy program, adding in an element around policy. This is our mission statement, our purpose and values. And I just put this up here as like a reminder that this kind of guides our actions and what we do. And as part of a policy program, we're trying to take topics that people might not have deep familiarity with, or on the other hand, a deep familiarity with from different perspectives, and trying to bring, like, again, a very interesting group of thought leaders. And in this case, not just people with multiple backgrounds, clinical, regulatory, private sector, public sector, but offering like a forum for discussion. So there's a chat function. I'm going to warn you that most of the time, because getting 3 people of this caliber for 1 hour, you can listen to them probably for several hours, but I want to emphasize that put things into the chat. My job as the moderator is to try to make this work. And as part of the way of my background, before I read the bios of our 3 panelists, I'm an internist and a professor in the School of Medicine, and have been part of the new policy program at the Biodesign Center. And we have 4 inaugural fellows who are in their first year at Stanford and will be doing 1 year in Palo Alto, and most of them a 2nd year in a policy setting. So this is kind of a unique opportunity to actually practice some of the intersections that we're going to discuss today. Let me get to the important part. You've got 3 incredible people whom I'm lucky to know. As people are listening, when you get older in life, you just try to surround yourselves by people you want to work with that you like. And that's actually the secret to success, if anyone asks. But I'm lucky to know all 3 of these people in varying capacities. And I'll start first with Dr. Hilary Marston. She's the Chief Medical Officer of the Food and Drug Administration, the entire organization. And so, yes, that does mean she has an incredible amount of responsibility that unpacks into leading the real world evidence efforts, clinical advisor to the commissioner of the FDA, overseeing the offices of policy, clinical policy and programs, and doing everything in between. She previously served as a senior advisor for the global COVID-19 response on the White House. And she also was the director for medical biopreparedness and response at the U.S. National Security Council, and medical officer and policy advisor for pandemic preparedness at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health, trained in internal medicine and global health equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital, also did her MPH at Harvard Chan School of Public Health. If you're intimidated, you should be. But I actually know Hilary, and she's not intimidated. She is one of the most collaborative individuals. And for me to say that, having worked in DC as long as I have, that is not a statement I make about a lot of people, but really excited to have Hilary here. Hopefully we can engage her with the Stanford community even more, because it's a very interesting clinical intersection that she's participated in. All right, next up, Basit Chaudhry. He's an internal medicine physician and medical technologist, MD, PhD, trained in kind of clinical excellence, as well as a set of skills in technology, payment, health services research, and the use of data and analytics to improve clinical care. He started his company about a decade ago to address what he describes as the jarring discrepancy between how much of a modern medicine miracle we're seeing today, CRISPR, gene therapy, cell therapy, but how much of the experience of healthcare is horrible, antiquated, and frankly outdated. So that's the intersection that Dr. Chaudhry lives in. He started, and his training was at UCLA, and spent time in the Division of General Internal Medicine and at the RAND Corporation. Was also the lead research clinician at IBM Research. Have his medical degree from NYU, and has been an advisor on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, and an author of the PCAST report on health information technology. Also someone who lives a lot of DC, whether he likes it or not, and has been at the intersection of policymaking, clinical medicine, and kind of what entrepreneurs have to do when they're interacting with large organizations. And then the third, last but not least, is also a close colleague and friend, Dr. Jan Pietszch. He's CEO of WingTech Incorporated, co-founder, sorry, and he's also an adjunct professor at Stanford University, part of the biodesign, a very integral part of the biodesign policy program faculty. And his focus at the company he co-founded, WingTech, focuses on health economic evaluation, early stage tech assessment, and strategic decision support. I've been lucky to see Jan teaching, and he does an incredible job of taking people who might be nascent, naive, not have the background in HEOR, and really getting them up to speed and understanding model-based assessments and how to actually apply this from a provider perspective, a payer perspective. So he has been, I think, one of the most important parts of getting the policy program kind of off the ground, and look forward to him also continuing to have a close role. During his time, he's got an incredible background, as all of our panelists do, but he's received degrees, and I'm going to mess this up, but he's received degrees from one of the preeminent universities whose name I cannot pronounce in Germany, and also from Stanford University. And he has also done, during his doctoral research time, at the FDA's Office of Device Evaluation. So he too understands, again, clinical intersections, pain points on the private sector, and the regulatory environment. So with that, I'm going to set the stage. Resolution on this is not as great. I wanted to just allow for our panelists to each, in their own words, kind of talk about, I think it's fair for me to say that people who might not spend their day-to-day like the three of you do in real-world data, real-world evidence, to get them confused, to maybe just give us some context setting, and where you kind of, when you kind of come into a room, like where you operate with these definitions, and feel free to talk about that specific to your organization. Oh, and I do want to say something. We are recording this. There might be people watching this. I say this as a disclaimer. All of our panelists are speaking as themselves, like they're not speaking on behalf of any large organizations they might represent, and they're speaking as individuals, and what they say should be taken as their own commentary. So this is just something I say as a disclaimer for everything, because that's exactly the truth. So this is from the National Academy of Medicine. I tried to pull like how people have kind of offered conceptual frameworks. We've talked a lot at Stanford about conceptual frameworks, and I think that this is kind of an important aspect of where the data evidence applies to what you see here, which is really around kind of like the drug discovery, from pre-discovery, preclinical, all the way through kind of phase 4 and the kind of PMA phase, whether you're a device or a small molecule, et cetera. Then let me offer, this is from Biogen, large manufacturer. Sometimes like it's just helpful to see the different ways people portray this. So here you have, I think it's nice to have this visual, actually makes it easier to follow. You learn about real world evidence and kind of real world data, and what that means, sources, how this kind of leads to like insights on the left with the evidence. And then finally, this is from the FDA, just from a slide presentation. Hilary might have even had a role in like the words on this slide, but this is just from a webinar that the FDA had done around just trying to talk about how all of this applies to the work of the Food and Drug Administration. And I think this is, again, you're seeing the same things, right? There's real world data and there's sources. And then there's the evidence, and that's the clinical evidence around some of the risks related to a specific product. In this case, in this example, it's a medical product derived from the analysis of real world data. And then you have more real world data. That is not easy for me to say fast, so I won't say it fast. So with that, what I'd like to do is kind of offer, let me get back. I'm going to get out of the sharing mode for now, and ask our panelists. If you're not talking, you can stay. Oh, have I done this? I'm gonna have Molly help me to make sure that we pin people as they're talking. Basit, let me just start with you. I wanted to ask if you could put in your own words, or as in the context of how you would like to, what I just kind of went through, and how you might explain this journey, real world data, real world evidence, and kind of thinking about it, perhaps even in a more practical way. And we'll go through each panelist and let you discuss and go through each of your examples. Basit, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really excited for the discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. And looking forward to chatting with everyone. And I think this is like a great place to start. I think there's a huge amount of interest in real world data and real world evidence. Times this can be confusing, so I think it's a great notion to start off with some points on level setting. I think broadly speaking, I think a good way to think about this is if you're sitting in front of a patient and you want to basically tell them, look, I think this treatment is appropriate for your care. I think that the benefits of this outweigh the harms. Right? I think what you're trying to do is have a foundation or a body of evidence behind you through which you can draw a valid, clinically oriented inference that's applicable to that patient or the population of patients that patient belongs to. And I think sometimes we often talk about a lot in terms of complex algorithmic techniques or types of data or sources of data, but really what you're trying to do is draw an inference. Right? And that inference is, in particular, I think there's many different types of inferences that are involved here, but I think the particular one that's relevant or most relevant in many ways to what we're engaged in with real world data and real world evidence is really to valid causal inference that's applicable to a particular patient population. And I think this is, again, it might sound kind of, well, why are we talking about this? But this notion of causality is incredibly important, and it really underpins a lot of what we're doing. And there's a range, in the National Academy of Science framework touches on this, but there's really a range of different types of evidence generating activities across a spectrum from bench science, all the way across the translational spectrum to the point of care that really creates the underlying infrastructure from an evidence standpoint for why we do what we do at the point of care. Right? So it's helpful to think about this as a spectrum through which this notion of a causal inference becomes strengthened or weakened. It's really not a one and done thing. It's really a progression across this life cycle of evidence generating activities, all of which have a different fitness or purpose, which is, I know, a notion will probably come up in our discussion, and the different applicability to different patients. And I think in line with this, another thing which I think sometimes gets lost is this inference that we draw, these sets of inferences, they have to feed into some kind of explanation. Right? So if you're talking to a patient, you need to explain to them, why do I think you should start this drug? You need to explain to them, why do I think the potential risks of this surgery or this medical device are worth it? You need to be able to, explain to a patient, why should you enroll in this clinical trial? Explanation is a critical part of medicine. And I think this is also, we just want to level set on this because I think it's also going to be a fundamental part of the discussion, particularly as we get into more and more complex discussions of different kind of technologies or algorithmic approaches, which might be appropriate to contemporary real world data and evidence discussions. So I'll just stop there and look forward to hearing the other panelists' comments.
And thank you. And just we'll kind of get into this theme. I think this kind of notion of why and how and I think that could lump in as like a lot of what we do in medicine in the explaining time in our 15 minutes. But that is not necessarily a set of translated materials that comes along with evidence or data. It's often, here are the clinical guidelines, here's what we know so far, and then good luck trying to explain it. We've all been trained to kind of try to use our best communications, but we don't necessarily have those tools. So thank you. That'll be a very interesting, thank you so much. Hilary, feel free to kind of build on just your own, how you think about this when you walk into a room and you're talking to people, whatever their level of comfort is with the topic, and then explaining and grounding kind of where is the FDA kind of coming from. I know people have been very attentive to every single thing the FDA is putting out on this. So maybe give us one thing we like to do in these webinars is to kind of demystify, it's a lot of really great, amazing people trying to work on something and doing it as fast as possible. So tell us kind of how you approach this topic, and then what, if you can, share kind of what you're working on at the FDA. And then maybe later we can also do any time you have for, asking for input from, we have a lot of experts that are tuning in, and you might want to get kind of input, or there might be a public feedback opportunity. So Hilary, please.
Wonderful. And thanks so much for the groundwork that you guys started laying there. I think both of those interventions were very important. And thanks for the invitation, by the way. So the definitions that you put up there, those seem obvious, and yet I think every single one of us sees folks interchangeably and incorrectly applying the terms RWD, RWE. Seems obvious, right? RWD is the data. It is the actual elements that you're pulling the information from. RWE is the prove it element, but yet we see them used incorrectly. Another key point here is that real world data is not new. There's more of it now. We swim in it in the clinical setting. We know that. But these sources of data are not new. We've been using them in clinical trials since clinical trials began, really. But we seem to often tie ourselves in knots now that it comes in a fancier form, right? But the fundamentals of what we need to understand about the data in order to interpret the evidence have not really changed. From an FDA point of view, the question that we're trying to look at is always going to come down from a drug point of view to safety and effectiveness, right? What do we understand about the safety and effectiveness, and what can we attribute to the drug in question? So that comes down to that causal inference question that Basit was getting at, and he's absolutely right to emphasize that. It can come into play in a number of settings for us, but I break it down into the preclinical, the pivotal, and then post-marketing. So preclinical, early preclinical, as you're starting to set the stage for that pivotal study or studies that you're going to conduct, the ways that it comes into play are really our understanding of the disease generally. For example, if you want to consider an external control, you need to really understand the natural history of the disease, the heterogeneity in the natural history of disease, not just from a total population point of view, but also from a temporal point of view. So if you're going to have any hope of being able to compare to another population, you need to have a really solid understanding of that, and that's going to come from your real world data sources. In addition to that, even if you're not trying to use an external control, those sorts of data can obviously be very important as you're trying to understand what your effect size is going to be, what the sample size that you're going to need in a pivotal study is, et cetera. In terms of those pivotal studies, then it comes down to the actual information that we're going to need to have in order to determine that it is safe and effective. So that is where a lot of our activities have centered in terms of giving guidance to industry, to investigators about the elements and the characteristics of the data that we're going to need to see in order to have that reassurance that we can rely on the data. And then the third part is in post-approval settings. And this is probably the setting where we're most comfortable with using real-world data. But it's an evolving area because we have just the proliferation of data sources, both in terms of individual registries, but also in terms of the ability to draw that data directly out of non-traditional sources. If you look at what the FDA has been doing in this area, we have tried to set forth our thinking about where we're going in real world evidence. We put out a report in 2018 that basically told you exactly where we were going to go, the types of guidances that we were going to offer. So we focused in on the sources of the data, what would be a suitable source of data, the way that the submission should be formatted, and then some elements of design. We said the guidances that we were going to do, and we've been executing against that. The other bucket of work, though, is developing our comfort with real world evidence. And this is really where it comes down to regulatory science, right? So our understanding of the quality of the information. The best, most tangible example of this is the RCT duplicate effort that came out earlier this year. I think it was in JAMA, where they were looking at large randomized control trials and the ability to emulate that information using real world evidence. I think the most important thing to me there was the ability to predict which studies you might be able to emulate. So if you can predict which ones are potentially amenable to that, then you have a very powerful tool as you're moving forward to consider prospective projects. So a number of things in the works, a number of things already done, but looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Jan, never to be last, and certainly not least, but wanting to also then help you round out, because we want to kick off into more of a discussion. So Jan, give us, so I had already kind of intimated some of your teachings in HEOR. You and I had a very nice discussion in advance, kind of talking about the overlap and also the distinction. So this has been helpful to hear each of your frameworks, like kind of coming into the room, how you describe this, how do you describe real world evidence to students? And then how do you put this in the context, somewhat overlapping, but distinct, or at least explain to us kind of then like where, and I think this falls into a lot of what Hilary just described about kind of post-marketing, like from,
Right.
once you have something commercial and then it's in the real world, then what? And so please just walk us through that and maybe highlight any points you want us to consider as we'll go into the next set of questions.
Thanks, Kavita. I think from the health economic perspective, adding to Hilary's point about safety and effectiveness, right? We're interested in understanding resource utilization, right? And specifically costs. And so frequently in health economics, that requires longer term understanding of the likely clinical progression and costs and resource utilization, right? So, in this field, we tend to rely on short-term clinical evidence and then augment it or supplement it with real-world evidence. And I think there's tremendous opportunities now with more data sources being available to really help us inform more accurate models, more accurate projections, right? I think the other important point is, specifically in medical devices, there is frequently a learning curve, right? So technologies get used in a better way and more maybe refined process. Outcomes improve over time, right? So there is less resource utilization. If you think of transcatheter aortic valve replacement, for example, the duration length of stay, right, has come down from maybe 5 days in the beginning, including a day or two in the ICU, to now 1 day, essentially sometimes same day discharge, right? And so these kinds of trends, can be informed by registries and claims data and real world data and really change the profile of a technology over time, right? So beyond the original, randomized gold standard randomized trial, right, there is really a need to update scenarios, update projections, and with the new set of available data and increasing amount of data, right, we just get to more accurate estimates and assessments. And I think one more point from the innovators' perspective and what we focus on with our biodesign fellows is frequently we can identify and quantify and validate needs much more appropriately, right, with more real-world data being available, even to the point where we identify economic needs, health economic needs, in addition to pure clinical needs, right? And so there's tremendous opportunity. We need to ask the right questions and apply the right methodology, and obviously, know the limitations of any available data.
Yeah, just to follow up on that quickly, because I think this is something that intersects with all the students we're encountering in fellows, biodesign innovation, but I'm seeing it kind of this resource utilization is something that it takes a little while to kind of understand. Will you just expand a little more? You and I have talked about this from like a payer perspective, thinking about it as a system. If you're like Kaiser Permanente and you have an entire capitated population, will you kind of just maybe walk through just how that actually plays out? You could use TAVR, but is it understanding what the resource utilization is from the various stakeholder perspectives, including out-of-pocket cost to patients? Where do we think about the resources and what examples are they?
Right. So it's in essence, the question, what is the, cost? What is the kind of length of stay related cost? What's the procedure cost, right? And we try to track that and understand that. And importantly, when we look at long-term, also a long-term time horizon, right? We want to understand how do we reduce subsequent events, right? How do we change the progression of a disease, right? Or a condition, and what do we know about the costs, right, of that process, or of a rehospitalization, for example, that we try to avoid. So that's cost and resource utilization that helps to inform these models.
And that obviously for whether it's a drug or device, that's not necessarily, that might be something that the pivotal trial kind of is taking into account. But again, it's something that we like to point out that, the Food and Drug Administration really thinking about safety and efficacy. And sometimes people who might not understand the different levers, public sector levers, understand then there's a whole other, when we're talking about the resource utilization and thinking about exactly that, the resources you need to allocate, and that's CMS. And so the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or a payer, Kaiser, et cetera. So I just want to offer, and I think this is important important for what we'll get into next. So we'll kind of start, and I'll start with Hilary next. I want to get into something around data. And Basit touched on this with just talking, all three of you have talked about the multiple inputs and sources of data. It would be nice to have maybe each of your perspective, because these data sources are getting more complicated. And I think that I'm going to, if I don't mention the words artificial intelligence, I think they actually might fire me from Stanford. So I will say that there's a lot of there's reality and there's a lot of hype. We actually did a webinar called Beyond the Hype on AI. So it is the complexity and the multitudes of data sources, which then lead us to, I think, a very important conversation that I'm not very smart on around data standards. Hilary, maybe explain, because you laid out kind of where the FDA started and what they issued in 2018. I know data standards are are a very vital issue. Can you talk to us about, the way the agency or the way you're leading some of these efforts? And then I want to offer, this might be an opportunity if folks want to ask questions. We do have some questions, but I want to offer an opportunity of, if you have an example of how the data and kind of this volume of data has helped the agency to either think about something a different way or just to inform the agency. And I can think of so many regulatory examples, but I just want to offer you that kind of platform to say something.
No,
To start with data standards.
Yeah, so data standards. So in terms of just the guidance of how we want to see data submitted, that is available, and that's sort of that it's not so changed from other sources that we would need data, and it still needs to come in and CDISC, et cetera. But taking a step back on data standards and the promise of extracting information from the EHR, which I think is a more important question. There are any number of items that we would want to see standardized, where we would love to reduce the swivel chair issue, where we have research assistants copying things out of the EHR and trying to put them into a clinical research database. The problem is you have to focus, right? And you have to try to pick elements that are going to be the most important for the broadest number of applications. In our case, that's for clinical research studies, but for other folks, it might be for clinical practice. We spend a lot of time focusing on the end of that result, right? So what should the data field look like? How should it flow across the information ecosystem? Which elements actually should be standardized? That's all well and good. I think that we don't pay enough attention to the first part of that chain, right? How is the clinician actually interfacing with the EHR? What do they need in order to improve their work? And what can we then leverage for what we need? So an example of this is smoking cessation, right? So I might be writing my note in clinic, and I might have a place where I can click on how many pack your history, right? You might be writing your note and you might say, this person smokes 2 packs a day. And, Basit might be writing his note and he might say long-time smoker. Great. How are you going to standardize those? Sure, maybe you could find some great AI algorithm that would pull that all together and give you smoking history, perhaps. But none of those things are actually going to help you with the clinical decision that you want to make, which is, do I send this person for a CT, right? So I think we need to pay more attention in these conversations to what's going to be specifically useful to the clinician. That's both going to improve their practice, but it's also going to make them more likely to want to put the data into that format in the first place. So I want us to start refocusing our conversation on that portion. And that's broad, right? This is not just an FDA thing. This is FDA, NIH, CDC, and well beyond the US government. But I think that's one of the things that we're starting to do as an FDA, is look beyond just what we need for our purposes, but also reach out to partners so that we can combine forces. So that's one of the things, in answer to your question about what is FDA looking to do, looking to build out on, it is really that broader purview of where we sit in the research ecosystem, right? We don't end with safety and effectiveness. We still have the post-marketing safety surveillance. but also we're a public health agency, right? So we want to be contributing to the evidence generation more broadly around the use of products.
Right. And I know we've got questions coming in, so we'll do, I'm going to leave some time so we can capture, there's very similar themes here. Basit, let's talk to you about any kind of commentary. I know that you've worked deeply with claims data of different types, private and public. Maybe you can offer some of your comments on data standards, as well as like where I'll say it's probably, I want you to maybe just, because you are small business, entrepreneur, innovator, kind of where there's also some frustrations with trying as a business that might be focused on clinical improvement, how to think about like the multitudes of data and the lack of standardization, the lack of the fact that we don't all describe smokers a certain way, and frankly, how even our electronic health records play a role in that confusion. So go ahead.
Yeah, those are all great themes, and kind of to build off what Hilary and Jan were commenting on. One of the things we see is that there's obviously a tremendous amount of excitement on real world data and real world evidence, and that's both the relationship between new types of data, the amount of data, and new algorithmic techniques, including our different artificial intelligence applications. One of the things we see on a really practical basis that up to now, and I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts on this. We've applied real world data and real world evidence generation activities to a relatively limited number of use cases. Right? A lot of those are really related to regulatory approval from the FDA. But to Hilary's point, the entire post-market phase is the vast majority of the life cycle of activities that you're going to have in terms of the intersection between the patient and, say, an agent. And we see incredibly important critical questions that emerge at the point of care all the time. And we don't have a systematized way of taking those questions from the practical sphere of what the clinicians are seeing and then systematizing them into an evidence generation activity. Right? So just as an example of this, the context for a lot of physicians has really changed quite a bit as we've changed payment and engaged in various kinds of healthcare reform activities. I think particularly the expansion of Medicare Advantage has really changed the structure of medicine, the structure around medicine a great deal, and the decision-making structure. So one of the things that happens as you move from fee-for-service to value-based payment, and this is a huge impact on how you use data and how you think about standards, is access decision-making changes radically. So access decision-making, how do you use an agent, what's required, what is the evidentiary basis of this at the point of care, moves from the payer in its traditional lens to things like utilization management. It moves down closer to the point of care. That's really how you tie accountability together. So we see this all the time. We've done a lot of work on value-based payment, particularly in oncology, and access decision-making changes. So the kind of questions physicians are asking changes, right? How should we manage this adverse event? That's often not clear. And there's this whole field of gray decisions that impact things like access and value that become particularly relevant. It becomes really an issue of how do you design a care model, how do data inform this? So the range of questions really changes because the nature of the care delivery changes. So I think these are all really critical things. Just so example, there's a whole set of use cases that literally arrange on what is access decision-making at the point of care and how do you set that up? So those are things that we really think of quite a bit and work on quite a bit. And that really changes what are the use cases for the data, and that should really inform the standard. So to Hilary's point, I think you have to think out what are the use cases you need, starting off from a particular perspective. We look at it from the standpoint of patient care and clinical activity and try to work backwards from there to better inform that. And then the algorithmic techniques one can use really should extend from there. In a way, if you look at contemporary artificial intelligence approaches, what you're really trying to do is engage in this incredibly high dimensional, you're trying to engage in the systematized search of an incredibly high dimensional space, right? And we now have the computational power to essentially do this, often through brute force methods. But to Hilary's point, we actually have a great deal of knowledge in medicine, right? We should be leveraging this knowledge to build better models up front in things like EHRs and other applications, because that will produce data that's fit for different purposes, and it'll make the search of that high dimensional space much more efficient. So we can create a virtuous cycle between things like AI and clinical applications if we systematize what we're doing around more specific use cases and translate them from use into standards, into application. That's really the virtuous cycle I think we need.
And you've talked about this with claims data. I mean, in terms of the sources, there's a multitude of sources, is the easiest to take if someone were trying to do that. And let's say, whether it's a research effort or a company they wanted to start, would that be the place to start, just from a claims perspective, to actually have a little bit more standardization across certain payers?
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, I think claims have been an interesting area to work, and just practically from a company standpoint, been very good in the sense that, one, they are relatively standard, specifically with respect to Medicare. The other thing that they do is they provide a really nice 360-degree view of the intersection between how the patient interacts with the healthcare system. So it gives you a lens of different service utilizations that you can really try to understand, what does the patient journey, or formally the patient trajectory, look like? Where does it branch? Where does it vary? So for those reasons, it's been particularly good. We work with a great deal of other data as well. I think you really want to start off with, what is the right question type of inference that you need to draw for the use case that is relevant to your question, and then work backwards. And that's one of the things I really try to do. And I think particularly as a small company, as a startup, you really want to work backwards as much as you can from what is the point of value, what is the discrete issue that you can kind of tackle, and where can you build the most differentiation, and then work backwards from there to the data, rather than trying to start off with the data and kind of swim your way through that high dimensional space. So that's the way we've approached it as a startup.
Great, thank you. All right, Jan, we're going to do this, and then we'll do kind of a lightning round. There have been questions from the audience and then some other questions, so I'm going to try to combine themes. But Jan, I wanted to ask a similar question around data standards, but because you have often kind of taught me at least about kind of this intersection and overlap with HEOR, it would also be interesting to kind of hear about how some of those data standards, like how this might be applicable to alternative pathways for estimating qualities. This is something an audience member was interested in, but kind of apply the conversation around data sources and data standards into kind of what you are doing for the future of HEOR research, and where again, where is there a role for AI? Has there been one, and what you could see coming down the pipe in the future?
Yeah, and good, all great points. And building on Basit's point, right? I mean, there is plenty of data, right? Increasingly, yes, it needs to be clean. It needs to follow a standard so that it can be analyzed, right? I think the opportunity and real challenge is for us to pick combinations of data, right? And apply a reasonable methodology driven by a clear question or questions on hand, right? And then get to new insight, right? So I think, again, for us as innovators and analysts, right, of data, the awareness of what's out there, right, is increasingly important, right? And being able to know, the limitations and benefits of certain data, right? And then using different sources in a smart way to get to the insight we need, right, to have to inform our decision. On the quality of life side, since you asked qualities, right, there's tremendous potential in following patients over time, right, through wearables or other technologies, to have a much more, even along a trial or beyond the trial, right, a much more refined assessment of quality of life, which also helps to, demonstrate the potential benefit of a new solution in a much better way than it was possible previously. So
what's something we've been very US centric. You work globally. You work globally, Jan. So maybe do you have any examples of what other countries are doing that we should be aware of in the United States that you want to point out, whether it's in kind of this use of data in a way that is applicable? Doesn't have to be HEOR, but are there some trends you're seeing globally that would be worth calling to attention?
Right.
And even from a regulatory side, I know you've talked about the EMA and other regulatory entities in other parts of the world and how they're thinking about this for their drug approvals, et cetera.
Yeah, I think, looking at some European countries, Scandinavian countries, right, for a long time have done joint registries, right, on hips and knees and many other, medical needs, right? So there's ample data that can be globally used, right? And in the UK healthcare system and other national healthcare systems, you have the benefit of 100% coverage, right, of costs, incidence data, utilization data, right, which is beyond, what we see in the US when we look at Medicare, for example, right? We would only have the elderly population, right? And need to look at commercial data sets for younger patients. But some of these national systems provide good data that at least can guide some decisions even in the US context, I think.
And the access piece is something also very interesting, since we're able to model before the Affordable Care Act and after different kind of points of access expansion. So thank you. All right, we're going to do a little bit. I'm going to pick up the pace and also incorporate some more of the audience questions. I'll start, Basit, with kind of I want to ask you, is there, as we look kind of to the future and opportunity, I think you and I have often spoken about like uncharted territory. I'll say that I'm still very interested in how we can do more in that communication piece. Like, I feel like as a clinician, we are inundated and have a very hard time prioritizing. There could be many technology tools that help us do it, but nothing kind of substitutes like how to talk to a patient about their cancer risk, or what to do when there's cognitive decline, and understanding tests. So there maybe just, do you have like a kind of a example that you wish we could spend more time, a clinical one? It could be anything. I'm giving you an open floor here, and just to get the audience thinking a little differently. And each one of you are going to get a different version of questions, so don't be afraid.
Yeah, I think this issue of cognitive decline is like a really good one that we often see. So I do a lot of work in cancer care. So in a clinical trial, what you're in part trying to do is standardize all the context. So you could just focus on what can you attribute to the intervention, as Hilary said before. So you want to literally standardize all you can on the context. At the point of care, though, the population does not map exactly to what was done in the trial. I think another really important part of trials is that they often have an implicit care management function in them. There's a nurse coordinator who is usually extremely involved with what goes on with the patient. So there's kind of almost a care coordination or care management function that's implicit in trials, which is fine from the standpoint of internal validity of the trial, but is one of the things that creates a challenge in terms of its external validity in practice. So if you have a patient with cognitive decline, there might be a level of support, for instance, that tacitly comes into play in a trial if they were included, that you don't have at the point of care. So you're kind of more on your own. So then you have to start questioning, could I give this, for instance, therapeutic to this patient? Like, one of the things we've seen in cancer care a lot that really comes into decision-making with clinicians are issues of social isolation. Like, if the patient is elderly and relatively socially isolated, can I safely treat them with a platinum-based therapy? Literally, this question comes up all the time. Or for head and neck cancer, should I put them on cetuximab? Can I trust them to be able to get to the clinic? So these are all like this rich set of questions that really fall in some spectrum of external validity. And I think this is often underappreciated. We often think that, it's often said that, we don't practice evidence-based medicine in the United States to the degree we should. I think in many ways that could be true. But I think often what's underappreciated is the changing context in which clinicians are making decisions, context which is not measured. So I think that's a really key part of what we should use real-world evidence for. Better characterize grade decisions at the point of care and understand the context that the care is provided in.
I think you and I have spoken about it's becoming a not uncommon example. Used to be an anecdote about having a patient with 2 primaries. That is now becoming, especially as I've seen kind of, PD1, I mean, between PD-L1s and kind of, stacking immunotherapy, I don't think I've ever seen so many kind of changes in that social. I mean, we're seeing what's incredible. It's what you said before, modern, kind of medical miracles kind of slammed into like a society that's not prepared for them on many levels. So I think that's a great example. And by the way, like, all of these examples are spaces I would offer that people should apply a lot more design thinking about what the user needs. We speak a lot about trials and intentions and don't have much of the users. Jan, I'm gonna get to you next, because I want Dr. Marston to have just the final kind of offering in words. And we're gonna, for people who are listening live, we're gonna end, we always end a couple minutes early. I believe in Zoom bio breaks, which nobody offers me in life. So I'm going to make that happen in my webinar as long as I'm in charge. So Jan, I wanted to ask you, you and I have spoken about some important policy areas that need better attention One of them, I think, is since you work so much with med tech entrepreneurs, that a lot of people have asked you, me, how can we advocate? And I think, unique UDIs, unique device identifiers, have been kind of like spoken about to incorporate that into electronic health records for, better real world kind of research. And that would even help inform kind of the HEOR. What is like a space where it would be really important to see better technology adoption? Maybe it is UDI. You can use that example if you want, because someone asked about that. But then how do we see that drawn into not just the kind of FDA conversation, but I'm going to ask more about like also CMS as well, or a payer, because we need to, I think there's like a lot of innovators at Stanford who see it as a very kind of straightforward issue. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been working on UDI, unique device identifier issues, for about 20 years. And it is for the person that's asking, feel free to get in touch with me. I can walk you through the history and put together a panel of us who work for presidents and senators on this issue and why it isn't as straightforward. But Jan, I want to ask you kind of what could we be doing better so that we can harmonize the discrepancies on the technology side, the regulatory side, and the payer side? So I'm asking you to solve like world hunger, but I would love to hear this is where we get some policy exercise, how to think about this.
Yeah, maybe thinking of, the registries that exist, right? Device-based registries. I mean, there's the Vascular Quality Initiative, VQI, right? There's TAVR and SAVR. I mean, there's comprehensive registries that were mandated even by CMS, right? And run by CRF and others, right? And so good, I think, effort. I mean, quite burdensome to report, right, on each patient, but provides really an opportunity to learn about the evolution of the practice, the procedure, right? Get more data, right? Again, to supplement clinical trials. And, I think as technology companies think about, tracking their device and the performance, right? I mean, maybe there are opportunities to have a direct follow-up and some kind of, active communication with devices in the future that provide data, right? That then can help to, add additional evidence that can help to inform regulatory decisions, reimbursement decisions, right? And demonstration of value, honestly, right? So within, what is feasible with data security and so on, there might be a new wave, right, of opportunity to really have signals that you follow over time, right? Which I think all brings it also back to the efficiency of clinical research, right? We want to accelerate it and spend, a reasonable amount, but not more than that, right, for that evidence collection. And so anything that can help us to be smarter, in doing it and more resource efficient is great.
And Jan, I'm going to plug, you were a co-author on the JAMA paper that came out of the Biodesign Center on the CMS TSET, or at least informing kind of the timelines for FDA approved devices to receive kind of a national coverage determination, and just literally kind of a quantitative analysis of what that timeline looks like. It strikes me that in the proposed kind of mechanism of what CMS is doing for novel reimbursement of medical technology, that this could be the opportunity. So UDI, as an example, this would be the place, because that TSETs over the questioner. I would offer to you that CMS has laid out a potential pathway that still needs a lot more information, that where UDI could play a role. And there is an opportunity there where the FDA and CMS are coordinated, because it's a novel mechanism to get to national coverage.
Right.
Not straightforward and not one, but is that fair, Jan? I just want to say that this is something that we could use a novel payment mechanism to kind of bake in, if possible.
Right. Yeah. It would be interesting to hear Hilary's perspective, from the FDA.
Yeah. Hilary's got a lot of questions. So what I'm gonna do. All right, Hilary, you get to close this out. I'm gonna ask you to touch on three, so let's do it in pieces to see what time we have. One, I think people have had many, I'll say, questions, concerns. Where does real world data trigger action? That could be in the form of inspections. This could be in the form of just follow-up. And I like to say, as a preface, I never worked inside of the FDA. I did a lot of work with the FDA in government, and I had to do a lot of work on the congressional side. I'll say that the answer is always, usually the FDA is always interested, that the agency is always interested in data, but really, practically speaking, without getting too specific for time reasons, what do these real world data kind of submissions, how could that trigger a number of actions by the FDA?
Yeah, so I think what you're really talking about there is inspections, right? So, and the first answer, I think you only have to be at the FDA for about 2 weeks before you give this answer to everything, which is that it depends, right? And it really does. So taking a step back, what we're looking at when we talk about using real world data for submissions is traditional designs that are drawing in some real world data or real world evidence studies where you can be talking about randomized control trials that are pragmatic in design, so set in the normal clinical care settings. The key point here is whether it is used, whether it's just contextual data, or whether it is actually supporting the pivotal evidence that's being submitted to the agency. And that's the lens that we're going to look at it with. The other thing that's interesting about this is our inspections program is these study designs are new for everybody. And our inspections program is in some ways learning with the research community. So we know that that we're learning what needs to be looked at, what will be important to the reviewers in terms of understanding data provenance, in terms of understanding data quality. So that's something that's a work in progress for us, and something where I do expect to see some adaptation of our approaches moving forward.
Okay, great. And I'm going to ask you again, just because the theme has come up about coordination with other federal agencies. We just touched on coordinating with CMS. Feel free to talk about that. People have asked, just for history, the U.S. Digital Service has kind of functioned as a bit of a, I think of it as a skunkworks team that goes across all agencies, but that's because when we had the use case in the White House, it was really around the digital service helping to deal with the Affordable Care Act enrollment. So I might have that mislabeled, but maybe Hilary, briefly touch on kind of how you coordinate with other agencies. And that includes, by the way, we've had questions about lessons learned from COVID. I think it's fair to say that, and I'm going to answer this, my observation of what worked well in COVID was how much we can do when we are coordinated and we have all the parts aligned, including the payer, to get the data such that you don't shortcut on the safety and effectiveness, and that you don't shortcut on what you might need on the like in terms of resources. So very general contracting terms, not going through these kind of arbitrary prior authorizations, et cetera. That is the power of what we learned and I learned about drugs and devices. But talk about coordination and then anything you want to touch on and how this might have been informed by your COVID-19 experience as well.
Yeah, so I think drawing on that COVID-19 experience, one of the most important lessons there was our tendency in government to stay within our silos does not serve public health well, particularly in the setting of an emergency, but also in settings like this where we need better information to take care of our patients in a more effective way. So we are increasingly starting to focus on the relationships across government, whether it's bilateral. We have quarterly meetings with CMS on issues that are of critical importance. So both leadership teams together, NIH similar, or in this evidence setting, we're actually trying to bring all the agencies together at once. To the specific question around the U.S. Digital Service. So I love the U.S. Digital Service. I got to work with some of the folks very closely on the COVID team. For example, we had a brilliant colleague, Natalie Cates, I'm just going to give her a shout out here, who designed everything from the website where you could find your vaccine to the infrastructure that was behind the delivery of diagnostics. She was fantastic, right? It was give her a problem and she's going to help solve it. And you probably know her actually from healthcare.gov. They are the fix-it folks, right? They're specific to projects. The folks who we really work with very closely to coordinate some of these health IT questions are at HHS. So they draw heavily from the USDS, but it's the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology led by Mickey Tripathi. We just call it ONC, so I always have to look up what that stands for. But they are substantially involved in the work that we're doing. They set the core standards for electronic health records, but they also help with efforts like trying to expand the number of standardized research fields that you might want for cancer trials, for claims quality data. Those result in optional packages, USCDI plus packages that health systems can choose to buy or choose not to buy. But we work very closely with them.
I thank you for thank you for doing a multiple set of questions in one. And I want to thank all our panelists and giving you all virtual applause. I knew we could just throw random questions at you and you do a great job, but we threw random and incredibly technically complex questions. You did it under an hour. I want to thank our listeners who are live and then anybody watching on recording, and look forward to our February webinar series where we're going to tackle data standards, interoperability. And if you don't know what TEFCA is, you're going to learn and it's going to become a household phrase for you. All right. Thanks, everyone.